Thank you for joining. This is Live with Miami's Community News, and I'm Michael Mo. And our guest today is Jaime, pronounce your last name, Suchlicki, from the Cuban Studies Institute.
Right.
All right. So first, tell a short story about why you started this and what it does.
Okay, I've been at the University of Miami for 50 years.
That's 50, 50, folks, 50. Okay.
Yeah, but I retired 5 years ago.
Okay.
And then I decided to continue the work I was doing at the university. And I started this, it's a think tank is what it is, this institute. And we do research, consulting.
And people outside of Miami might not think it's important to understand what's going on. Not too far from where we're sitting, it's maybe 125, 150 miles from here. But it is important for us and the world to know about it. So let's talk for a second. What inspired you to create this institute and to study and to consult with people?
Well, all my life I've devoted to Cuba. I'm a Cuban myself. I left Cuba in 1960, came to the United States, and at that time I was thinking of going back to Cuba. Things were going to change. Nothing changed. So my life took the course of me going to the university, studying, and I kept on going back to study Cuba and Cuban-U.S. relations and Cuba's relations with the number of countries, the Soviet Union at that time and China and so on. So that became my direction.
So soon after leaving Cuba, you wound up going to the University of Miami.
Well, yes, a year after I arrived.
Well, that's pretty fast. When I was a young child, around that time, I remember saying to my father, what is it with these Cubans? They come to Miami with nothing, and 3 years later, they're head of banks, and they have duplexes and cars and houses and husbands and wives. What is it specifically about immigrants and about Cuban immigrants that drives them, generally speaking, to achieve?
Well, first is that the fact that the Cubans that left in Cuba in the 1960s were the middle class and upper middle class of Cuba, were the businessmen, were the professionals that didn't like Castro. Castro was confiscating property and doing a lot of things to Cuba and moving toward the Soviet Union. So a lot of these people decided, well, they wanted to go to Miami, get out of Cuba, and hopefully return when there was a change. Everybody hoped that Castro was going to be in power for a short time, but he stayed there for 60 years. So
it is pretty amazing when you think about that. We do have a picture of the now Freedom Tower, which was the Miami News back in 1923, 1925, et cetera. And when I look at it, I think of all the thousands of immigrants, specifically a lot of Cubans that went there, over the years, and what it stands for. And frequently, I'll take people through the building. They say, "That's where I went. That's where I went." Had a 72-year-old lady in the building the other day. Michael, I was there. So how do you and the Institute and your team stay current with all the things that are going on in Cuba and our interaction in the United States and maybe even specifically in Miami and South Florida?
Well, we interview people as they come in. So we keep on top of what's happening. We get information from various embassies. We have contacts with the State Department, the CIA, and foreign agencies. So we're up to date on what's happening in Cuba with no problem.
So there's been some widespread conversations about some quiet noise in the Cuban embassy or in Cuba, and that hurt a lot of people, 100 plus U.S. government citizens. And it seems generic in the sense they were there, they got it. If you weren't there, you didn't get it. Any thoughts about that?
Well, it happened not only in Havana, but it happened in Russian embassy in Moscow. It happened in other embassies. So there seems to be a continuous operation of some intelligent group, whether it was the Soviet Union or Chinese or even the North Korean, trying to discourage diplomats and disrupt the operation of the diplomacy in Cuba and in other countries. So maybe something there.
And I can imagine that the government employees that are suffering, and some of them tremendously, are wondering, well, what are we as a country and as a global community going to do about this? Right? Is there anything?
Very little you can do, because first of all, we didn't know where it was coming from. Second, it started and it stopped for a while, and then it started again. So how you can counteract this stuff is very difficult.
Would you like to share some of your future initiatives at the Cuban Institute that you're working on today, or that maybe in a year or two you can be working on?
Well, the thing that we've been working for the past 3 years since I left the university is a database of Cuban-Americans. Cubans that lived in the United States, and they became prominent in the business community, in the arts, in you name it. And so we've created this information with their biographies and their life, and it's a resource for anybody who is interested in Cuba.
And it's important for young people to understand that. And to be able to look and say, listen, I went to Miami-Dade College. I'm thinking Madeline Pumurig says, you come to Miami-Dade College. We're going to get you through. You can become an electrician or go to MIT. And that woman received spontaneous applause as she was speaking. I could receive phone calls. Lady said, I'm Cuban. I had 2 little kids. My mother was a maid. My father was disabled, and she helped me. And to hear her story about coming here with zero.
Well, this is the idea, developing the story of people that have become prominent in America. And they've done it in a very short time. And with a lot of effort, they become either prominent lawyers or prominent businessmen and so on. So any one name that you want from the Cuban community now that you know that is a prominent, you go to this database and you'll find their lives there.
That's wonderful. Not too long ago, a couple of years ago, I'm having dinner at a place on Bird and 127th, 130th Avenue. And outside the seafood restaurant, they have a small boat that some people, some Cubans, came over in this boat. It wasn't any bigger than this right here. I'm thinking, what is the drive that they risk their lives at 90 or 120 miles, depending on where they took off from, that they're willing to go out there in the ocean all by themselves, all right, and say, I want a better life and I want to go to America. I'm sure you've talked to many of those people.
Sure. Wanting a better life is one. Fear for what they can happen to them if they stayed in Cuba. The repression of the Castro regime against the Cuban people made a lot of people go. And a lot of Cubans, middle class, upper middle class, didn't see any future with Castro and what he was doing. So
that was in the early 60s.
Hmm?
That was in the early...
Yeah, in the early 60s.
And specifically, that's the years that I started remembering it. I said, one of our neighbors, he just came over. The guy was running the bank. How can they do that?
Well, either he was fired from the bank was taken over by the government, and he decided to get out.
And at that point, I heard the term born with a silver spoon in your mouth as my father's pointing his finger at me. But we realized there are plenty of examples.
It was very difficult years. I mean, a lot of people suffered jail and confiscation of their businesses and their homes, and they had problems. They had to get out of there. And the struggle in Miami was not easy. I mean, language and
I remember NCNB, no
right.
Cuban, no blacks. I read Tony Bryden's book, Hijack, and he talked about when he was in prison there. And he was one of the first blacks to speak Spanish. And what a great book. And Tony actually worked here for a while. I forget what years it was. But to read his book and what it was like when he was in solitary confinement. And that, you know, he was there for a while. And then when he got out, he came here. I didn't realize until I went with some places that he spoke at over 100 universities about Cuba and about jails. We have up on the board a picture of Renee Rodriguez, who spent 20 years in Castro's jails. She wrote a nice book, and she presented it to the mayor one day when she was here. So Miami is full of these great stories of successful people who came here with little or nothing but a drive to make stuff happen. So what is it like when you read the stories of these people that come here with little, and 5 years later, it's not just mainstream, it's not even a conversation anymore, it's just life. So what's it like when you meet these people?
Well, the idea was to create this database to have recorded the history of this group of people. And we have about 300 or 400 in the database. And these are people that had made it in the military, in law, and in whatever professions they did well. And it's something for people to read when they're in Oklahoma, sitting in a cold winter, and they want to find something, or if they're Cuban exiles themselves and wanted to teach their children, look what these people did in Miami.
I think that it's vitally important. I'm Jewish and come from a long line of Jews, and it's important that minority groups speak their truth so that the children that are going to follow understand the struggle and how important it is to be on your path and to be successful, because we know that the little children are always watching us.
Sure.
Always. Even when they're not, even when you think they're not.
We don't want them to watch us.
There they are. And so so let's look down the road a couple of years for you and the Cuban Institute. What additional things? I see Mike Carricart right over there. There he is. He's so all right. Way to go. All right. So what are some of the things you're going to add on at the Cuban Institute?
Well, we do continuous research. So we're keeping very close observance and analysis of what's happening in Cuba on a regular basis and what can happen in US-Cuban relations or relations between Cuba and Russia and Cuba and China. So we're not only Cuba-centered, but we're also looking at what's happening in other parts.
And certainly recently, because of all the violence that's going on across the globe, at least the globes that we're used to, we see that there's definitely a connection between all of us. Nobody is in a vacuum when you think about it. You know, so you got the Russians, the Ukrainians.
Well, Mike, the Russians have been interested in Cuba for 30 or 40 years now. They've had a base, they've had facilities in Cuba, they had a listening devices in Cuba to listen to American intelligence conversation. What we have found out recently, and this comes directly from Russia, from intelligence sources, Russian intelligence sources that have shared something with us that may be of great concern to you as an American here and to the United States. The Russians have, you know, during the missile crisis in 1962, they brought nuclear missiles to Cuba, and that's what created the crisis. And now they've been digging in the floor of the ocean around Cuba and the sand underwater and placing silos, Russian silos, with nuclear missiles. So the Russians at any point can press a button in Moscow or in Havana and launch those missiles, which are very close to the United States, which could do a lot of danger. So I am sure the U.S., I'm hoping the intelligence of the U.S. is following this, but this is a new threat to South Florida and to the United States, the fact that these missiles are in the waters of Cuba, in the ocean.
I remember during the Cuban Missile Crisis, young boy, and seeing all the Army trucks going down to Key West.
I was living in Miami, and I was standing on Biscayne Boulevard, seeing trucks.
So what was that like? You had just left Cuba, and you see this is going on.
Number one, they believed that we were going to Cuba very soon, that this was the end of Castro. Second, a fear that this may be a war, and there will be major concern, and that Florida may be destroyed. So this was a very, very emotional from the point of view of what could happen and what would happen.
When I was in elementary school, we used to have bomb practice. We would get underneath the desk.
That's correct.
And so when you think about it, well, what else are you going to do? But you realize we're little kids. Okay, it was all fun and games. But what it really shows the impracticality of this weapons of mass destruction, that we are powerless once those things are are here. So what are some of the pressing issues that you see in relations that exist between the United States and Cuba and the surrounding areas?
Well, first of all, the United States, under various administrations, has had the idea or maybe the illusion that they can influence developments in Cuba. Some of them, like Obama, through negotiations and through giving benefits to the Cuban government. Others by trying to be nice and hoping that normalizing relations, Cuba would change its policy and its opposition to the United States. It hasn't changed. It hasn't changed for 50 years. The Cubans, you can't buy them. And sometimes you can't buy the North Koreans or the South Koreans or the Russians. I mean, we try and we hope that, well, with easing our policy and negotiations, we're going to get concessions from the Cuban government. It hasn't happened, and it will not happen because this government are more concerned about their own policies, their own position in the world, if you want to, rather than giving in to the United States. So those who advocate normalization with relations and good relations are good people in the hope that this policy will change Cuba. And it hasn't changed North Korea, it hasn't changed Iran, it hasn't changed Cuba. We gave Iran $150 billion in the past few years. Iran is still an enemy of the U.S., is still an enemy of Israel, so it ain't going to change.
An expensive enemy. So we have to sort of figure out how to operate within that, understanding that that's how they are, that's the way they're going to be, all right, for the foreseeable future, and maybe for most people it is forever, right? So we have these little kids come in here whose parents are now highly successful Cuban-Americans, and I hope that those parents take those kids and take them to see that little boat and say, somebody you knew somewhere around here took that little boat to come over here. So you best make the best of what we're doing here. And so if somebody wants to reach you and talk more or take a look at some of the book that you have of these 300 plus people, how could they contact you?
Well, they can visit the Institute. They can look at our webpage. They can call me on the phone.
Okay. All right. So we have a Cuban Studies Institute.us.
Correct.
So people can go there and they can see.
Correct.
All right. And so what do you think might be some of the obstacles that you might be facing in order to continue growing the Cuban Institute?
Money.
Money. Oh, but son of a gun, right? So
well, no. Look, a lot of the older Cubans have disappeared. Unfortunately, they died. Some of them have moved out, and so on. So the wealthy Cuban community has been reduced in numbers, and many people that help Cuban studies and were very interested in Cuban study now feel, well, this is going to be there forever. We're not interested in this. They are interested in music. They're interested in other things, and they don't want to fund research about Cuba. So that's one problem. So
is that part of like becoming sort of mainstream? It's not the struggle that it was 20 years ago?
Oh, absolutely. It's very different.
So right now in Miami-Dade County, there are millions, right? Millions of several million Cuban-Americans.
Yes.
And they made such a difference. And I remember 25 years ago, they used to say, this is the year that Castro's going down, and that's why the finger's broken, and everybody's going to go back to Cuba.
Well, that's why the fingers are like that.
Right? And I remember people saying that. I go, why? I say, their whole family's here. Their grandchildren are here.
They're necessarily not going to go back. And if they go back, they're going to see a country that is a disaster with diseases, and the economy is bankrupt. So it's going to take people a lot of time to convince themselves that they want to go back and return to Cuba. I talked to Cubans that recently arrived, and I said to them, well, you can go back quickly. No, I don't want to go back. That's it.
And frequently people say, well, why don't they stay in Cuba? Just like you don't want to stay in Topeka, Kansas. It's time. And then you got this oppression that is occurring. And so we come from a place, I think as people, listen, you don't want to live in Miami anymore? Go move somewhere else. You want to live somewhere else? Go to the somewhere else. So I congratulate you on more than 50 years of bringing forth the story about Cubans and Cuban-Americans. I think that it's wonderful. If people want to speak to you, they can go to Cuban Studies.
Well, they can read my book, Cuba from Columbus to Castro.
And they can find it all over the place. They go online, and they're going to be able to find that. Now, again, that's Cuban Studies Institute.us. They can find you, and if they want to call you, they're going to find a phone number over there.
Absolutely.
And they're going to get your book.
Okay.
I mean, thank you so much. God bless you. Folks, thank you for joining us. And Michelle, thanks for producing the show. Folks, and remember to take care of yourselves and your family. Have a good day.